Had a big head, rounded ears, 6 feet in the body maybe, with a very, very long tail, very muscular build. As it was walking, it was still looking at me, and that's when I really panicked.
It looked at me and thought, oh, there's a human there, I'm not scared. You say, well, I've seen this big cat, and some people just flatly refuse. They think that Britain's such a sweet little island, we shouldn't have predators that size.
I heard this growl behind me, nothing like a dog's growl, and just like anything else in life, you're sat on your own there. I don't care who you are, how brave you are, something like that will put the shivers up your spine.
As she was walking, before the cub came out, she flicked this tail. She literally flicked it in the air, and I simply could not believe what I was seeing. It was the most extraordinary feeling.
It threw its head back, he said, and it made this sort of round.
But when you actually realise that there are big cats living in Britain, it changes everything.
Welcome to Big Cat Conversations. We speak directly to people who've encountered one of Britain's big cats. We also discuss the bigger picture. Why are unofficial big cats being seen, and could these cats even be naturalising without us knowing? If you've had a big cat encounter in Britain and would like to discuss it, email me at rick@bigcatconversations.com. You can find other episodes on the website bigcatconversations.com. I'm Rick Minter, and thanks for joining me. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Big Cat Conversations. Today's episode is a theme edition on sheep farming, looking at sheep farmer perspectives when they have a visiting big cat around. And I want to say at the outset that there are different experiences from sheep farmers. 2 other sheep farmers that I've met this year have had contrasting incidents on their farm. One in January in the Cotswolds had a roe deer killed on his land. His vet assumed it was a big cat kill, and I did when I was called to visit. That sheep farmer has never had any of his sheep touched by a big cat as far as he knows, and this was a new experience for him. Another sheep farmer that I was called to visit in South Wales in April, May this year had through that time 4 different sheep impacts, 4 eaten out sheep over 6 weeks on the farm. I was invited to put up trail cameras on the farm, and it stopped, of course, as soon as I put the cameras there. He actually said he would be quite happy to sacrifice 2 more sheep to get the cat on the camera for the evidence. So maybe he wouldn't have said that if it was a ram that would take the impact or pedigree sheep. So there are different experiences, different perspectives. Today our 2 different guests have had direct experience of dealing with a big cat. Okay, well, I want to introduce our first guest, Gordon. And Gordon was based in South Wales at a farm where he ran some sheep, and he's going to talk about some incidents which occurred between 2007 and 2012 at this farm. And Gordon's now moved away, but he's very happy to talk generally about all the events and what occurred and how he felt about it. So Gordon, thanks very much for joining us. If you could start by telling us how you first began to realise there might be a big cat around on the farm.
Certainly. We had recently moved to South Wales, some 7 months before, 8 months before, and May time, 2007, we had a second youngest was born. Very, very hot it was, if I remember well, and we had all the windows open in the bedroom. We had new to farming, taken on some sheep, and the next morning I walked out, and at the end of the garden, which is no more than 80 metres straight from our bedroom window, I found a yow, and she would have been about 80 kilos, and she had her throat crushed and her whole rear ham was gone. And the thing about that was the baby at the time, he was quite uncomfortable in the heat, and we had all the windows open, and both of us were mostly awake all of the night, with the disturbances, and we didn't hear a thing.
And no dogs setting off?
No, we had 2 dogs in the yard, didn't kick off at all. One was a sheepdog, one was a gun dog. Neither of them gave us any indication there was anything going on. And they were approximately 100 metres from where the incident took place.
Following that, you heard sort of screams in the valley that you had no experience of, and you actually thought that was a person, didn't you?
I did, yeah. I came home one evening late from work. It had been a long day. I was in construction as well. And I remember getting home and my dear wife said, she could tell I was a little bit stressed. This is going on a few months now. This was November, December. And it was very cold, about -2. And as I got home, she came to the door and very considerately, she gave me a beer and she said, look, things aren't quite right inside just now. Why don't you just have a beer in the barn and chill out? And I said, sure. I was sat in the barn on the end of the quad, and I heard this screaming. And it went on, and it went on, and it was a yowl. Could have been human, but it went on a long time. It sounded like someone being struck, a woman specifically. I actually got to the point that it went on so long, I went inside and phoned my neighbour and asked him to stick his head out the window. He was about 200-300 metres, yeah, something like that. And I remember the call. And it wasn't a person. It was identified later on as a female mountain lion screaming for a mate.
Yeah, but you had no idea at the time. You assumed
not
it
at
was...
all. Not at all, but it was no fox. Previously I've done a lot of shooting. I don't do it anymore, haven't for several years, but I was 25 years shooting rifles and shotguns, quite versed, and the screeches and squalls that come from the countryside at various times of the day and night, evening, morning. But this was something I'd never heard before.
And it sounded like a human in distress or a female in distress.
I would have said it sounded pretty much like a woman being hit, but it repeated itself.
And people can hear that on the internet, actually. Just Google puma screams and they'll hear what you're talking about. Gordon, it took you a while before you first sort of saw any signs visibly of the actual creature. Did you get more hits before you sort of saw its eyes? Can you tell us that, the next sets of incidents?
Yeah, after that, it was August. It was very hot. And we'd put 2 young tups in with the horses, which was in the field next to the house, just above it. And I went up one day, as I did, and we had sheep in 2 other fields, and I went up in the quad, and I noticed with the horses that one of the tups is missing. And I had the dogs with me. I stopped the quad, climbed over the top gate, so it's then probably 300 metres in a diagonal to where I was heading, because that's where I'd seen them last. So I walked across the field, and the 2 horses stayed in their corner where I got off the quad. They weren't following me down. They weren't looking for food and stuff. And the 2 dogs came with me. One was a German Wyhead pointer, a shooting dog, and the other was a cross collie used in the sheep. And I got down and I found the other tup, and he was underneath a hazel hawthorn hedge, and I could just see him. And I went in to pull him out, and then there was a kerfuffle, an altercation, and I looked to my left and the 2 dogs take off. Now, it was August and we hadn't had our first cut done yet, so the grass was quite long. But I reached in and pulled this tup out, and I phoned the vet, and I described the injuries, and there were 4 puncture wounds, maybe 3 inches apart, the upper ones, and 2 inches apart, the lower ones. I could stick a pencil in each of them, and it had been dragged in there by the throat. So I got him out, and I put him in the barn as I phoned the vet. He was very distressed. And that was, you're beginning to sort of put one and one together, because you don't have any cause for this. Why he should be stood under this hedge with these symmetrical puncture wounds in his neck, around his throat, and the scratch marks in the back of the head as well. After that, we lost, over a period of years, 13 head of stock, 2 particularly, 45 kilos of meat taken in 5 hours. I've got the photographs peeled inside out. Now, I put those yowes down in the front field next to my neighbour's, and it's quite heavily wooded and he can't see onto it, but it's right near fresh water. And when I went, that was about 11 o'clock at night, and there was 2 dogs free in the yard, which was 100 metres away. And when I went down at 5:30 in the morning, I found out a stripped out carcass. I mean, she was like a wind chime with the skin just pulled up round her neck. Her head was intact. Nothing broken on her apart from one shoulder was dislocated. All sinews and everything in place. But every ounce of meat had been licked off and removed. Their rib cage open. Like I said, she was like a wind chime.
I can't remember. Did you have a good daylight visual of it at all?
Not daylight, but in my lamper's lamp, I had it up a tree, and it was body size of a Labrador, flat, squat, wide head, tail 2 to 3 feet long, as thick as my arm, yellow, green, fireworky bright eyes, about 4 or 5 inches apart. And I had the lamp on it, and my daughter said, "What's that, Daddy? Is it a sheep?" Because we're looking at it almost level, but the drop of the land after the fence meant it was about 15, 16, 17 feet above.
What do you think it was doing? Just watching you, waiting for you to leave the scene so it could get on with its evening's business?
No, it followed us up. That's when I was showing the kids how to work a lamp, and the younger children were all screaming and laughing, because I would flick through a rabbit. You flick through a rabbit and you cut the lamp off, and then you bring the lamp back, and the rabbit sat up, and that's when you shoot it. And they're showing the kids how to do this. And we went on like this for 200 yards from the house up to the quarry. And then, who's now the middle child, said to me, "Dad, can I get a go of the lamp?" And I said, "Of course you can." And I turned round to where we'd been lamping, and I pulled the lamp up, and I saw these eyes. And the child said to me, "What's that, Daddy?" And I took their hand and I said, "Come on, we'll have a look." Because I'm looking at it, these fireworks up a tree. And I got to within 12 feet of it with a lamper's lamp, which doesn't give you daylight, but it looked to be the colour of a grey squirrel, size of a Labrador, big front paws, big, thick, long, 2.5, 3 foot tail, stared at me. And that's when my child said to me, and I'm holding the hand, and I'm only 10, 12 feet from it. And they said, "What's that, Daddy? Is it a sheep?" And I was just saying, yes, sweetheart, it's a sheep. It's a sheep. And it dropped silently 15 feet in the bramble. At the same time, 200 metres away to my left, the horses are going crazy in the dark, and my wife shouting me, "What's upsetting the horses?"
You told me at the time that you did have a visit from a public body, and we won't name them, but a significant one to do with agriculture, and that person informally acknowledged that you had a big cat around in their view. Is that right?
We got a visit shortly after that, and they asked about, because we were, I wouldn't say we were off the radar, but we were smallholders with rare breed flock. And they came up for a visit, and I kept photographic evidence of all my fallen stock because I didn't have any fallen stock. She came up and they had a look at the flock, and she was very complimentary on the standard and the conformation, etc., and the healthiness of the flock of sheep we had. And she asked about fallen stock, and I showed her pictures of the fallen stock, because the fallen stock we had, which was 13 stripped out carcasses, because you meant to take them to a hunt yard or whatever, and I said, "What's to take to a hunt yard?" I was told I was to carry on taking care of it in the manner I had been, which was, you've got nothing but bones left, really, in the skin.
And there was an acknowledgement that there was a big predator responsible, but that was off the record. Is that?
It was off the record, completely off the record. But I could have been fined, or had my license to keep stock removed in the back, but I wasn't, there was stock missing, but I was showing photographs of the stock, why it was missing, is my interpretation. And not being able, I didn't have to defend what I had left. There was no point in taking it to the hunt yard because there was nothing left.
So technically you were doing something that was illegal or not according to regulations, but they were sympathetic informally because of the circumstances.
Yeah.
How did it feel, Gordon, sort of dealing with something that was taking stock occasionally and sometimes routinely, but that you couldn't see and you couldn't deal with? How does that bug you as a farmer?
Initially, it was quite scary, because when we first moved in, one of the children was only 2 years old, and there was an incident about the time that the ham was taken off the big ewe. We found another one with its head taken. and it was stripped out and stuffed in the hedge where we found the one with the 4 puncture wounds. My memory's coming back as we discuss. And took the head, I don't know. But the grass at the back of where the children played was 2 to 3 feet long, and we weren't anywhere near a main road. We were 3 miles from the nearest B road and a bit more to a main road. And it was quite disconcerting. It was worrying. But eventually you learned to live with it, and you just made sure the children knew that they made a noise wherever they went. You kept your eyes open and you kept your grass short, really. You learned to live with it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And the family adapted, you'd say?
Yeah. They were respectful, but with confidence. You know, they knew the times and the places and what to avoid. And if they're going somewhere dark, even in daylight, you know, to make a lot of noise. And
Did your dogs get spooked and affected? Because I visited several times, but I can't remember how they reacted.
We had the horses and the dogs. We always knew it was in the area because the 3 horses got in the middle of the field with their bums to each other and snorted. And you could go up to them, but they wouldn't want to be handled. They just simply wouldn't. You could always tell when the cat was in the area because the horses would play up. And these were horses that were well-schooled and would take anybody, anything, any age on their backs. But when it was about, you could tell the tails were up, the ears were forward, the nostrils were flared. We lost a dog, and I was convinced, though I have no proof, it was a spaniel, and I was away from home at the time, and it had quartered out, and we did find bones near the stream a year later that were canine, but I could never prove it. None of my neighbours ever picked up on the dog, and a very well-schooled spaniel, and that's what they do, is they quarter out, and then they come home. I mean, they don't wander, they're not retrievers, they're not flushes like pointers or stuff like that. I didn't ever think the dogs knew what the smell meant.
Okay.
Because they weren't used to it.
Yeah.
The horses certainly did.
Yeah, mind you, Gordon, and we'll get onto this in the podcast series eventually, but what seems to be the case is that pumas, mountain lions, cougars, the one that you heard calling, don't really have much of a smell. Leopards do have more of a smell, but I think sometimes dogs can pick up the movement and sense a big predator around for other reasons. But yeah, I don't remember you ever saying that your dogs were edgy sometimes in a way that other farmers and dog walkers who feel that their dogs sense big cats were. Now, you are, as you've been saying, skilled with firearms, but what did you think about if you wanted to take it out? It would have been a lot of practical difficulty, you feel, is that right?
I think that definitely, I mean, it isn't just the cries I heard. The stock that was taken was worrying, but towards about halfway through being there, I sort of felt not an indifference, quite the opposite. I sort of felt that we were living together.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't have any foxes, and I kept 30 geese for Christmas every year, and never a goose was taken. You know, I didn't have any chickens taken. There was nothing like that happening. It was stock, and it was sheep. Nothing else. I think I saw a fox for 9 years we were there twice.
Yeah, and you think that was the cat's influence?
I think there was something that was discouraging them from hanging about.
Yeah.
To put it simply.
If we get back to the concept of shooting a cat, even if you wanted to, I mean, if you could explain this, I remember at the time you saying, A, you didn't want to shoot it because you'd learned to live with it, but B, if you felt that you did want to, the chances of doing so would be negligible, so it wouldn't be worth trying anyway. Is that right?
It was one of the reasons I kept it quiet. I only spoke to a couple of people because, like anywhere else, well-meaning or not, you get some people that are a bit gung-ho.
Yeah. And
in the end, I sort of felt that it wasn't doing me any harm, and you were living together almost. And it was like a mutual respect.
Yeah. I
couldn't see any point in going all out to pursue it. And it was out of my hands anyway, you know. I mean, this thing was so smart. You know, I was just maybe giving way to my own ego to try and take it on, to take it out. You know, it was quite cheeky at times.
Yeah, yeah.
The thing was, you were getting signs like the scratch marks on the tree that were 6 feet up. You were getting signs that there was a big thing there, you know. I mean, that was 6 feet up in the middle of woodland that nobody else went to. And I hadn't been in for 2 months.
Yes. Gordon, we'll put that photo in the show description notes on the website so people can see that.
I didn't. No, I didn't feel I could gain anything myself for whatever reason in pursuing this and tracking it down, sort of thing. And it's been there a long time, I felt, and I was just new to this.
When you discuss the sheep impacts, the carcass impacts with other farmers and neighbours, what kind of response did you get?
Farmer communities are quite closed, and I had one or two came forward who had similar experiences, but nothing on my scale. And we just acknowledged that, and we acknowledged that we just keep it where it is, as simple as that.
Yeah.
They'd had it before, and they didn't want to discuss. They were private people, but I did find out from members of the public that came to the area, and you got all sorts of stories.
So there was some local history that would sort of reinforce big cat sightings in the location?
Quite a lot.
You reckon you were being picked on more than other farmers because your stock were untreated, they were never dipped or sprayed deliberately because you wanted to sell them for that sort of premium value?
Yeah, my wife and I strongly believe that. I know it's necessary in big flocks. I'm not making out I know better, but we had a small flock. It did build up to about 70 or 80, but they were rare breeds, and I kept an eye on them. We didn't have fly strike. We didn't have foot rot. We didn't lose any to that. We didn't dip them, didn't spray them. We looked after them, we nurtured them, and we tagged them and stuff like that, and we kept an eye on them, and we pulled them in. But no, we didn't need to do anything. We didn't want to do anything like that, with the view to the chemicals being drenched and all that sort of stuff.
And you feel that was influencing the cat's preference for your stock?
Well, I had neighbours that had, they had tag sheep on the land and stuff, They never let me know, but to my knowledge, they didn't have any hits.
You were one of the first sheep farmers that I visited and spent time with. Since visiting your land, Gordon, I've visited about 12 others, and I would say 10 of those are the same in that they had undipped, untreated sheep, and again they felt they were getting more hits than any neighbours they knew of. So I think there is something in this. I'm very grateful to you for sort of pointing it out, because I probably wouldn't have twigged for a while.
Well, no, you spray something, it's not as appealing to something like a cat.
I dealt with an estate in Scotland where they had ongoing issues for 3 years, and they said I told them this about untreated sheep, and so they treated half the flock. It was a big numbers we're talking about. Then they phoned me back a month later and said, we've had 4 hits in a month, week intervals as usual, give or take a few days, and all of those hits have been on the untreated sheep.
Yeah.
So that was a nice little bit of experimentation, which should have seemed to help cement the case.
No surprise there, really, when you think about it and you consider it.
Do you think you could have done anything, Gordon, which would have minimised the impacts?
Well, I did. I did. The people who had been there before were a retired couple, and they'd been there 13 years, and they just had tack sheep on, which had basically left themselves. When we moved there with a young family, I was a lot more active, and for the first 2 years, that's where the biggest challenge came from. That's when I began to really recognise what was going on. It was systematic in what it was doing, and I became more active then, and things fell away a little bit. We had 11 hits in 2 years, and then it came down to, I think all in all, we had 19 hits. We had 13 in the first 2 years, and then we had 19 all in all over the 9 years.
Gordon, did you, through this experience, did you try and assert yourself more on the land to sort of try and minimise the disturbances?
I took on the land in as much as that I managed it differently. I mean, we brought pigs in, and the pigs were behind an electric fence. They were free range, and that was a thing that we had a yow carcass, the one I was talking about, 45, 50 kilos of meat taken in 4 or 5 hours, was only 50 metres from where we had the pigs behind the electric fence. So you change the dynamic of what's going on, but it didn't change. I mean, it knew what I was doing. It sounds mad, but it did. When the horses got out, We had the horses come out. We were woken up one morning, and Rick, you've been to the farm, and you come through that shady bit at the bottom as you cross the stream. And we were woken up at the horses one morning, and one sheep had disappeared. Now, I don't know where it went, but that was another one in the field with the horses, and the horses had bent a 5-bar gate to get out. But of course, you had to go down the gully, which is darkness. They herd animals, and they know where they belong. There was a little bit of competition with the dynamic. I was just moving things around, and maybe I was getting a bit uncomfortable and used to his territory. And I did become more assertive with shooting, but I was shooting anyway. And I think the intrusion of the noise and the dogs by their scent and smell and the freshness round the area, especially around the perimeter and localised areas I had permission to go into, maybe discouraged it in the latter years.
Later on in the series, we'll talk to a guy who had a panther released on his land in Spain, and that behaved very differently from what we're used to in Britain because it was a fresh released one. And I remember him saying every time he went away, he'd come back to Britain for 3 months and then he'd go back in the spring to Spain, and he'd say, I know that it's been around, it's asserted itself while I've been away, and now I've got to wrestle back control. It's very interesting.
And even when I did, there'd be the hit like I had when Wales played the All Blacks. I went up, I've got a picture of that. The tup was dragged, and he wasn't a young tup. He was 2-3 years old. So he was basically not a tup. He was a young ram. But I went up and fed the horses, and they came up to the gate. I think that was about 8-9 o'clock at night.
You could see the marks in the frost, the drag lines in the frost, couldn't you?
Yeah, you could see where it was dragged, and there wasn't an ounce of blood. Everything plucked out, peeled inside out, a bit like, a herring.
Yeah,
it was like herring bones.
Yeah.
It's skinned to the back and everything taken off. And the horses, they were 300 metres away, and they weren't coming anywhere down there. They'd seen what had gone on, and they were having nothing to do with it, and they were all grouped together. And I didn't get them down to that gate again for 3 or 4 weeks.
I just wanted to get your sort of more general views about, having had that experience, including with a young family and with kids growing up. How do you feel personally, in general, about big cats being around in Britain?
I shot for game, and everything we shot went on the table. I wasn't shooting for shooting's sake. I could do that with targets. With a view to a cat, and a young family, I almost felt a bit privileged that we all got along together, if that makes sense. The children knew, we were all aware. Once we got used to it, we never felt threatened. It was a bit cheeky at times, but I think they should be left alone. I think they should be. Well, the thing is, if you acknowledge them, though, like I said, you've got a lot of aspiring great white hunters out there that might turn up with open licenses and do stuff and make a mess and create hysteria where there's no need for it. But we lived with it for 8-9 years, and we all managed to get along okay, Rick. It was scary at times, I have to admit. When I was adjusting to it, and my wife was, to take on this different sense of risk we hadn't been brought up with.
You feel any sort of aspiring great white hunters would have a challenge anyway, even if they wanted to, though?
They wouldn't have a chance. I've often listened to the people from the hunt yards and stuff, and I know guys from there, and they used to say, well, if there was any cats, we would have flushed them out. Not at all. From 3 miles away, you open the door of a kennel 2 hours earlier than you normally do. It's off in the opposite direction. You would be very lucky. Yes. Very lucky to pick it up. These aren't domestic animals. These aren't dogs. They're cats. And they're not feral cats. And I had feral cats on the farm.
Yes.
And they're a handful. Never mind something that is not a feral cat. It's a wild cat that's adapted to the environment into which it's been introduced, which is quite gentle. It doesn't want for anything. I mean, there's rabbits and pheasants, and it can pick up the odd this and that. It's not challenged. It's not hungry.
And incidentally, although I agree with your point about the cats, because of their hearing and their movement, they would pick up any disturbance and move well before there was a chance of them being flushed out in normal circumstances. I have to say, I have had hunts admit to me that they have flushed them out, incidentally, in normal activities,
They bolted a cat, and that would probably might be down to an overpopulation of cats in the area where it's actually sitting stone as opposed to heading home. Because, I don't know. We don't know. It was a very enlightening experience. I wouldn't swap it for anything. And no, I wouldn't want to see them shot. I think it's something that given time people will learn to get along with if they're ever acknowledged. But I saw it, I heard it, and I don't share it with many people.
We're going to hear another farmer 600 miles north of where you were, but similar experiences and still going on now, so that's going to be our next guest. Well, Gordon, we really appreciate hearing all of your sort of mixed emotions through that whole experience. And I know you've moved away now and it's not part of your life, but to revisit that for us and take us through it all, I think it's been extremely valuable. So we're really grateful to you. Thanks, Gordon.
It's a pleasure.
It's time for our word of the week. This week it is a term, obligate carnivore, and that means an animal which is a strict meat eater. It cannot eat vegetable matter. It doesn't have the physiology to digest vegetable matter. Our big cats, and indeed any cats, are obligate carnivores. The obligate part means by necessity. So by necessity, a strict eater of mammals, birds and fish and nothing more. A dog, a canid, can eat rice, fruit, etc. Droppings of foxes in the autumn have plenty of berries in them, for example. And the actual term for a dog or canid is a scavenging carnivore. They're primarily a meat eater, but they can digest plant material. Other obligate carnivores include crocodiles, mink and dolphins. And one of the ways that we see big cats are an obligate carnivore is when we analyse the fresh remains of prey. So, for example, on a deer kill, we'll often see the stomach remains pulled out. A cat cannot eat the grassy content of a herbivore. The strict meat-eating diet of big cats is also a reason why they may well have been released as early as war times, when people did not have a good supply of meat, of course, with meat rationing. So if you had a collection of big cats during wartime, you may well have felt the best thing to do was to release a big cat. So there's our term of the week, obligate carnivore. Okay, well, I want to introduce our second guest now, and this is another farmer, but somebody who is farming at the moment with her son in North Scotland, and she runs about 150 sheep. Thank you, Jean, for joining us. And Jean, can you explain the background to all of this? When did you first hear about big cat reports in the vicinity of your area?
When I came to this area from the south of England in 1978, my late husband and a friend had been out lamping for foxes the previous winter and had seen a large black animal with a long tail and a feline appearance, which had gone over a ridge. They pursued it, and by the time they got to the top of the ridge, it had completely gone. They were convinced it was a cat rather than a dog in the way it moved.
Okay, and since then you've heard neighbours and visitors, other people talk about big cat reports off and on, haven't you?
Well, following on to this sighting by my husband, there were other people in the area who reported sheep killed in an unusual way and sightings of a large black animal. When I say large, slightly bigger than a collie or smaller than a Labrador. And at that time, police and gamekeepers went out to look for the animal, but had no success in finding it.
And we're talking about quite extensive wild sort of fell land, aren't we, which does make it tricky. I mean, I know you can see sort of good distances, but it's still difficult to pick up a stealthy animal in that situation, isn't it?
Indeed, yes. We farm on several thousand acres of hill ground, which has got heather, gorse, small willow trees, so there's good cover for an animal.
And when did you last hear about a good sort of visual sighting of a big cat in the locality, Jean?
Over the years since then, there have been various sightings, but of the last 3 years, there's been an increase in activity. My friend who lives 6 miles from me was walking her dog early one morning on a hillside through gorse bushes, and she saw an animal cross in front of her and the dogs. Again, she described it as large, black, cat-like with a long tail. And there's been several other sightings over the past 3 years. Usually someone seeing them at night crossing a road.
You told me you had a delivery driver see one early one morning, is that right?
Yes, it was actually, I think, a plumber who was going out to his work, and he saw an animal cross the road in front of him, just at my road end. Again, he was adamant that it was a cat rather than a dog that crossed the road. This was early morning in the winter when it was dark, so he got it in the headlights of his van.
And is it exclusively a black cat that people are reporting, or are you getting any other colour cat reported? Mostly
black or dark. One lady saw an animal which she described as a light brown, which crossed the road in the daytime and went up some rocks and disappeared over the rocks.
Okay, so that would maybe suggest, if that was a credible report, a sort of the cougar, puma, mountain lion type, which often are seen in the same locations as the black ones. That's interesting. But predominantly black cats reported over, well, decades, really. We're talking about it, aren't we?
Yes, indeed.
Jean, I know that seeing these cats is really difficult, but what about calls? Does anybody sometimes hear suspicious calls at all?
Yes, that has been talked about. One lady said she heard a cry which she could only describe as a woman being attacked. Now, she's lived in this area all her life and is aware of the noise of a fox when it calls at mating time and a stoat when it gets a rabbit. This was, she said, quite blood-curdling and something she'd not heard before. Another man said he'd heard a similar thing, a screaming sort of noise, which he couldn't relate to anything he'd ever heard before.
That's interesting. Certainly the woman being strangled type noise is something we've just discussed with our first guest in this episode, and it would equate with the mountain lion, also called cougar and puma. That's a felis cat, not a panthera cat, so it's got that sort of higher pitched wail and screech, and that call is potentially a female on heat. So that's interesting that we're getting that consistency and that people are picking up as something different from the native animal sounds that they're used to.
Yes, a fox's call is very distinctive, and we hear that frequently.
Yeah. But interesting that it's, not the black one that, is being seen more. The black one, if it is a black leopard, which is the normal candidate, has got more of a sort of a grunty sawing noise and a coughing noise in its normal vocalizations. But so you're not hearing coughs and sawing type calls.
I haven't heard of anyone report that, no.
No, okay. Now, can you talk us through the sheep impacts, Jean? When did you first sort of find something which you felt was impacted by a large predator, but maybe not a dog or a fox?
On our own land, it would be 2 years ago in the winter, we found a carcass where the skin had been as if peeled off and cleaned, as if one would to make a rug. The bones were all picked completely clean, ribs broken off, and everything sort of in the area, the intestine to one side. But not as you would find where a fox comes to take a sheep that's died, that they come back and forth and take bits, leave bits lying about the area. This was very clean and a large amount of meat eaten within 24, 48 hours of that sheep being found there.
And since then, you've had how many sort of similar ones like that?
We have been fortunate in that we've only had perhaps half a dozen on our own ground that we have actually found a carcass in a similar state. But a neighbour who lives in the next valley has had numerous losses of a similar nature.
Is there any difference in how the sheep are kept and things like how they are treated in terms of sprayed or dipped? Is there any different smell or anything that should distinguish them in terms of a predator's behaviour and predator's sort of selection?
This is one thing, having thought about it, that is different now from some years ago. Dipping used to be compulsory, and the dips we used were very strong and smelly. And it was done regularly under supervision of the police because it was an obligation to dip the sheep. Now, since we haven't had sheep scab in the area, we tend to use a spot-on treatment for animal infestations, lice and ticks and so on, and it doesn't have the same smell as the old dips used to.
And do you feel that is influential on the predator's selection of sheep?
This has been my thought, yes. What's different now from some years back, when we weren't aware that there were more sheep kept, but we weren't aware of so many losses as there have been in the last 2 or 3 years within this particular area.
And Jean, you and your neighbour have also reckoned that you've been having rogue fox scavenging as well, but the evidence on the carcasses has been sort of different. Is that right?
Yes, there have always been foxes in this area, which is why my husband was out lumping. We've seen what foxes do to a carcass. Usually it's a sheep that's died of some other reason, possibly pneumonia or some disease a result of tick or liver fluke, which is prevalent in this area. Although the sheep are dosed for it, there's always some that succumb to the diseases. But the fox would come in over several nights and drag bits away and make a big mess. There'd be wool everywhere over a wide area. But these kills have been particularly clean, and that's the difference.
Yeah, the cats are very clinical and neat and tidy, aren't they? I have to say, I mean, when you showed me photos of the carcasses, I mean, I felt some were fox-like because they were much more messy. And then we put some I sent some cameras, and we fairly early on after that, we got a remarkable rapid-fire set of photos of a very large fox disabling a sheep at the front legs, and which of course is terrible for the sheep, but a fascinating picture to see what an artful fox like that is capable of. But of course, the consumption pattern would be very different from what you've explained as the more cat-like ones.
Yeah, that series of pictures quite astounded me. I didn't think that a fox would go in and attack a full-grown yow. What he did was he grabbed her by the upper foreleg, but that yow didn't actually die. When I went down in the morning, what drew my attention was another sheep had gone on its back in the burn and had actually drowned. But the second sheep was limping, and that's when I discovered the bite marks on the upper foreleg. And then checking the camera, discovered what the fox had done. He'd chased him down a hill, gone round in front of the yow and grabbed her leg. But he didn't bring her down.
Yeah, so even after doing that, even disabling her as much as he could still not predate, which is, again, the very helpful camera work. I think sometimes when the camera yields something which isn't big cat evidence but other activity, it's still very useful because it rules things in and rules things out. Okay, very interesting indeed. And what about rogue dogs?
3 years ago, we had a dog attack on sheep in a field that is within the forestry area where there's a walk where people take their dogs. We came down the forest track to find the sheep bunched, terrified in the corner, and I think there were 8 sheep had been attacked. Bits pulled out, lumps of wool, an ear pulled off one sheep. It was a totally different attack to these sheep that have been killed and cleanly eaten. It was a sort of frenzied attack, a bite here, a bite there, and the sheep were terrified.
Yes. And when you have the sort of what we feel are the cat impacts, the rest of, well, of course you don't always know because they're so remote from you, the flock, but are you sensing that most of the flock don't aren't aware because one of them's been taken out, but the rest really aren't really aware of what's happened?
Well, the most recent kill in this area, our neighbour, had a sheep taken down and the throat eaten out of it. In amongst the other sheep, within 200 yards of her house, someone in the house heard a noise at 5 a.m. and went out and discovered this sheep lying with the throat eaten. It was very fresh. They felt they had possibly disturbed the animal, but the other sheep were still grazing in the vicinity.
Yes. In a way they wouldn't be if a dog had spooked them.
No. I mean, certainly having seen the dog attack within the last 3 years, it was a very different thing.
Yes. I've seen the photo of the on the carcass with the throat gone, and my assessment of that would be that it's a classic sort of big cat, big predator clamp at the windpipe. They dispatch, one of their main favoured dispatch methods is the canines sink into the trachea, the windpipe, and asphyxiate. And then on that one, I think it carried on consuming in that area for a bit, and it probably would have then sheared through the back area to get through to the rich organs. But as you're suggesting, it was disturbed before it got any further on that one.
Yes.
Do you have any sense of why a cat is doing this, what we would call prey switching? Presumably there are deer and rabbits in the area that would be part of its menu at other times.
We don't have a lot of rabbits in the area at the moment. The population declined quite rapidly about 4 or 5 years ago. But there are plenty of deer, and we've seen deer with fawns on the hill, quite numerous, since neighbouring land has been bought up and the deer removed from there. Some were culled and others, we feel, were probably driven onto our land. So there are more deer about than have been. So why the cat would switch to taking sheep is beyond me, really, unless it's an easy option.
Yes, and especially when there are fawns around as well, they really would target fawns.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one judgment I have, which is only sort of one possibility, is that when this happens, it's most likely a young, inexperienced one that has separated from its mother earlier than is normal, and it hasn't really been fully taught how to predate natural game, deer, and so it's not as experienced as it could be, and sheep are an easier target because, of course, when they start getting going on their own, they do sort of bungle some of the predation events. It takes them time to get the knack, and especially when there aren't clean kills. I mean, I don't know. Have all the kills on the cat-like kills been clean and fully dispatched, fully implemented, to your knowledge?
No, that's one thing that we thought was strange. My son had a young sheep attacked. It died, but it was split behind the ear, and there was a chunk taken out of the leg and bite marks in the other leg. So yes, this wasn't the clean eating of an animal that it had caught.
But you didn't think it was a dog or a fox impact?
We didn't think it was fox-like at all, and if it was a dog, it had come and gone very quickly. Dogs are usually much easier to see.
Yes. What about the type of sheep? Are these are non-pedigree, and you're not losing rams? Is that the case?
No, these are North Country Cheviots. They're not a very large sheep. The rams are usually, they don't go out to the hill. They're kept on the fields in by.
Yeah. I did think you did send me a picture of a ram impact. Is that right or not?
That's my neighbour.
My sort of chats and conversations with different farmers around the country, they tend to be much more bothered. This is quite understandable if a ram has gone, because they're obviously more difficult and tricky to replace, and they have a key role. And also if it's pedigree sheep.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think about the losses?
Well, we're smallholders. 150 sheep is not enough to sustain you as a living. Crofting is done as a sideline, really. But obviously any profits we make are welcome. So losing more than one would expect from natural causes is a big loss, because it makes an impact on your breeding stock and your returns, from the year. When you're selling lambs, you won't have as many if your sheep have gone.
Is it consoling in a way that you've got neighbours to discuss this with, because you share experiences? Because I have spoken to some farmers where they seem to be the only ones having the impacts, and they find it tricky to discuss it with others. And what are the, does it bug? It must bug you all that you've got this sort of invisible predator around.
Well, yes. Again, it's small holdings here, so there's more of us in a smaller area than perhaps a big farmer. So yes, it's consoling to be able to discuss it. But our neighbour, who seems to be getting the brunt of the attacks, we all started out saying, well, obviously it's a wild animal, it's lovely to have wild animals about, and we really felt that, okay, an odd loss is okay, but we don't want to see the animal put down or shot or tracked or whatever. But my neighbour, who's now had numerous losses, is beginning to think that this is a rogue animal. It's targeting sheep, particularly hers, and she can't sustain the losses.
Yes. No, I have had that reaction from other farmers. Yeah, I think it often does come down to how long it's going on for, doesn't it, and proportionately how much of the flock are being taken out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there any practical action you guys think you can do that would minimise the impact?
Well, it has been suggested that using dip to try and discourage the animal, because of the smell of the dip, is not pleasant to them. That is one thing, to return to dipping with a smellier thing. Even
if there isn't a blowfly problem or whatever dipping would be for.
Well, it's the sheep scab that was the thing in this area, and that has minimised.
Yeah.
Again, it's cost, and we now have to be licensed to buy dip, and somebody with a licence has to oversee it. And crofters have diminished in numbers in the area, and it all adds to the cost, which eats away at the small profits one has from sheep farming in a small way. My neighbour has certainly had a gamekeeper who's quite a good marksman come up on a few occasions to go out the hill at night and has shot foxes, and hopefully this would deter the cat if it is a cat. But it doesn't seem to have done. The predator seems to be getting bolder.
Yes.
I mean, to come within 200 yards of the house at 5 o'clock in the morning when it's still light here, or it's getting light, it seems quite a bold animal, which is quite worrying. Would it attack a child if a child was out there?
I think luckily that we don't feel there's any experience to date of that in Britain, and it doesn't seem to be that's a sort of standard behaviour. I mean, although there's no rules on this, we are all learning, aren't we? What about dogs and horses? Are you able to sort of sense through them when it's possibly around?
I haven't personally found that. My friend who was walking her dogs said the dogs were spooked before this animal came across. They became nervous, and she wasn't sure why, and then this animal crossed in front of her. Another crofter said that her horses had been nervous and running around the field and bunched in a corner for no apparent reason. But personally, I haven't experienced this.
Yeah. What's the longest interval you get when there's no sense of the cat being around?
Well, over the last 2-3 years, it hasn't been more than a few weeks. There certainly seems to have been an upsurge in activity. Perhaps it's closer in that we're more aware of it. Sheep could have been taken out on the hill ground on moorland, and we're not aware.
Yeah.
My son lost over half of his lambs what we do here is after lambing time, and the lambs are about 4 or 5 weeks old, they go out onto the hill ground with their mothers and are taken in 3 months later at clipping time, ready for the sales. And he found that he'd lost half of his lambs that were put out, which is a big loss and unusual. But whether that was a four-legged predator or whether it's, as is becoming more common, a two-legged one, we don't know.
Yes, or a bit of both. To what extent do you think the local foxes have learnt that there's a predator around and they can scavenge sort of bits when the big predator's finished? Is that happening, do you think?
We've actually noted that there are less foxes over the last 2 or 3 years. Prior to that, the fox population was building up because there aren't so many gamekeepers about. And if young lambs were put out to the hill, we assumed it was foxes that were taking young lambs. But certainly with the cameras, the trail cameras out, the number of foxes that I've seen have not been numerous. Or would a cat take a fox?
Well, yes, in some circumstances. I mean, they're not going to expend energy stalking an animal that's difficult to predate, but I think opportunistically, certainly. And in my book, there's a fox carcass. I see other fox carcasses, again, very similar to the state of a carcass that's been eaten overnight from the sheep that you're talking about. So filleted out, cleanly eaten, so I think, yes, the answer is yes. So I think there's a key question which would be very good to have your view on, and that's your personal view on big cats being around in Britain, being out wild and even potentially naturalising. What's your sort of personal view?
I've felt since I've had knowledge of cats potentially being sighted in this area that it's part of British life now that the cats are out there, as wild cats have always been in Scotland. But if it's starting to change its behaviour and come in and take domestic animals on a regular basis, I find that slightly worrying, and perhaps I would want to see that animal, if it's a rogue animal, dispatched. If it's keeping to its natural instincts and predating deer, as you say, rabbits, foxes, and not impacting on farming, okay, that's all well and good. It's part of natural life.
So you distinguish between a rogue animal and the rest of the population?
Yes, this one that's in our area would seem to be changing its behaviour. I've had a badger come in and kill all my hens, which I understand they'll do when they get old or find it's an easy form of getting a meal. Normally they wouldn't do that. So then you get a bit cross and think, well, I don't want to have my animals predated.
Yes. What about if there was some system for compensating, especially your neighbour who's lost? I think if you said if it's occasional losses, maybe you can manage that. But if it becomes routine, would you like if one could be arranged some kind of compensation system? And it may be that one would have to make a judgment, because you wouldn't want sort of cheating in the system and people proposing any old carcass that was clearly not a cat for a sort of some compensation payment. But say there was a judgment, an assessment, and once something was sort of 90% ticking the boxes for cat-like predation, the landowner received a payment. Would that sort of help, or is there still an emotional, is it beyond not just finance, there's sort of the fact that you live with the sort of concern of a rogue animal about?
Well, yes, certainly compensation would help, because that's offsetting your losses, your financial losses. And I believe that happens in Scandinavia, where there are known predators. But that means that the government or the agricultural department accept that there are big predators on the loose in Britain, which doesn't seem to be the case.
Yes, I guess, though, there could be another system for compensation. One could be arranged through some kind of separate independent body. So I think we could get round the issue of the fact that it's awkward for a state body to invent the bureaucracy for this. So that's what's occurring to me also. But we could discuss that more as we go through the podcast. But I guess it's this issue that is it just for I think the finance is absolutely fundamental, but it's the emotional issue as well. To what extent is it beyond finance, and it's just the fact that you've got this nagging concern about a rogue animal that you can't control much?
Yes, it is. It's very emotionally upsetting when you've reared animals, from lambs up to mature animals. You help them with the lambing every year, and to see them eaten completely like this, the emotional impact on the dog from the dog attack was quite considerable. To see animals suffering unnecessarily. So obviously the animals are suffering when they're being grabbed by whatever big animal it is and eaten.
Yes.
So there's that emotional impact.
Yeah, and of course it's heightened if you're dealing with pedigree stock, as I've found, in the reactions I get from farmers and landowners. Do you all feel pretty much the same about it, Jean, or are there different opinions? I certainly have met some communities and farming families and property owners where there can be actually different views round the kitchen table as you discuss it, and that's natural on all sorts of things, I guess. But do you have different sort of takes on it?
I think we're fairly consistent up here with the people I've spoken to who've had losses or have seen the animal, that they don't particularly want it to be done away with. But it is the fact that it is getting bolder and more persistent at the moment, that this is perhaps a rogue animal, and we can't continue with it doing this for any length of time.
Yes. I think that's a very I think people would appreciate your position. Jean, we're coming to an end, and we have ticked all the things on my list, so thank you very much for that. But is there anything else in addition that you feel you'd like to say?
I suppose one thing that has gone through my head as we've been speaking is the current climate of wilding areas which we've been affected by, and some of the people who want to wild vast areas want to introduce large predators such as lynx. And having seen whatever is in our area causing an impact on our stock, it's a bit worrying that this would be intentionally made worse by introduction of large predators of different kinds.
I don't want to sort of take sides on that, but what I would say is that the advocates of that are saying that if they're not rogue animals, you won't get much of an impact, and there could be something like an independent compensation system and advisory systems and whatever, and the sort of testing of that could be, of the whole approach, could be changed or even stopped if the pilots suggested actually this is too much hassle for people. So if it was managed carefully and really responsibly, with landowners and farmers and people like you actually involved in influencing it, would that change your view, or are you too influenced by this unpleasant situation you've experienced?
I think this recent situation has made me think more about the fact that if large predators are introduced, they're not going to be confined to the area of who owns them or who's introduced them. They won't see boundaries. They'll cross over to where the food is.
What about the argument that if they do sort of act in the way that is assumed and is hoped by the advocates of the proposals, that it will be more like keeping deer down, keeping rabbits down, keeping the foxes at bay, so there may be hopefully way more benefits than disbenefits, and disbenefits can be managed and compensated. Do you take heart from that at all? Does that influence you at all?
Well, yes, if there was an agreed system of compensation for losses, but as you've already said, it is proving that loss is due to a certain predator, which could be quite difficult.
Yeah, I think it is important to talk through the issues, particularly from people with the direct experience like yourselves. And it's also interesting to hear your view that your understanding about the fact that there is a big predator out, perhaps through previous generations of people being irresponsible and having trophy pets that they've released and have now spread and naturalised perhaps a little bit. And occasionally a rogue individual does cause the upsets that you're seeing, so that it is it's so important to hear about it for real rather than just have the discussion in abstract. Well, Jean, I want to thank you very much for going through the various sort of mixed emotions you clearly have, and we'd like to keep in touch. We're certainly going to be returning to discussions with sheep farmers during the course of this podcast series, and we may well speak to you again, particularly if you have further events and want to discuss any twists and turns to what goes on in your local area. So for now, Jean, thank you very much indeed.
No, it's a pleasure.
Well, that wraps up this episode. Next episode, we will be visiting Buckinghamshire and the Chilterns, speaking to a witness of what appeared to be a young puma, and talking to Paolo, who will give us an overview of what's going on in the county as far as he's concerned as one of the key recorders of big cats there. So, join us next time for Big Cat Conversations. Thanks for listening, everyone.